Welcome to GM Mastermind, an RPG podcast catering to game masters looking to hone their craft. Each week, we bring on a panel of individuals known as the Brain Trust to cover a specific topic. Introducing the Brain Trust for this episode, Craig Shipman of Third Floor Wars. You can find him on Twitter at Third Floor Wars. Craig's got 35 years as being a game master. The RPGs he's run includes Mothership, Forbidden Lands, Call of Cthulhu, and Blades in the Dark. Most recently, he's run in Forbidden Lands, Fear Itself, and Mothership. If you love interviews with designers and creators, check out Craig's podcast, Tabletop Talk. If you want actual plays for games that are entertaining and showcase mechanics, check out his YouTube and Twitch channels. Links in the notes. Introducing Eric Salzwedel to the Brain Trust. You can find Eric on Twitter at SalzwedelEric. He's been game mastering for over 30 years. His expertise lies within RPGs such as Solar Blades and Cosmic Spells and the Mecha Hack. He continues to run those games as well as Index Card RPG. Find him talking about RPGs on his podcast's back catalog at the Omega 3D Chicken Coop. Hi, I'm Sean. I'm the moderator of the show. I've been playing RPGs for quite some time, and recently I'm game mastering Delta Green, the scenario Sweetness, and playing in a Forbidden Lands game. You can find me on Twitter at GM_Mastermind. In this episode, we'll be covering Duet gaming. That's one game master and one player. Now, on to the show. Craig, Eric, welcome to GM Mastermind and the Brain Trust.
Thank you.
Appreciate you having us. Yeah.
What the heck was the name of your podcast, Eric?
It's the Omega 3D Chicken Coop, and there's a story about that. You'll have to listen to the Omega 3D Chicken Coop podcast to get it. I'm going to leave you with that teaser. That's
so much better than the Delta Coop.
Yeah, yes, it's the Omega 3D Chicken Coop. One day maybe Omega 3D Chicken Games will actually produce a game, and it's a whole thing. I got a logo and everything, guys. Watch out.
I gotta love names like that because it's not going to be a problem to get the domain name, the Twitter account, like any of that stuff.
It's there.
Not too many trademarked 3D Delta Omega chicken coops out there, I don't think.
No.
All right. So we're talking about duet gaming on this episode, which Eric and Craig have both have experience. Craig, tell us a little bit about what you've, as far as duet gaming, what's your experience been?
Well, this is where you regret inviting me on the podcast.
I will
Sean.
cut you off. This one time at band camp. Shut up, Craig. Next, Eric. Eric, go.
So I, way back when in high school, I would do it all the time, right? Because that's all we could do sometimes, getting kids to the table. But most recently, I came back to it doing Chaosium's new Does Love Forgive, which is a scenario book that's got 3 scenarios in it, and all of them are duets. And I got the book because I pretty much buy everything Chaosium puts out now. And I was just like, you know what? I haven't done this in a very long time. And a good buddy of mine, Nick, who's been on the channel a lot, was wicked into it. And I said, let's go for it. So the most recent thing that I've done is one of the scenarios in that.
So previously, when you said you did it a long time ago as your kid, which system did you use back then?
Either D&D or GURPS, depending on when it was. I started with D&D, and then we all moved to GURPS.
Interesting. So one-on-one GURPS and or D&D. What edition of D&D? Do you remember?
I would have had to have been 3.5. Probably then. No, it may have been 2. Honestly, I don't know. Whatever you played in the mid 80s.
Mid 80s?
Mid 80s.
Oh, that would have been basic second. Or 1E.
It was the red box, I think. Yeah, whatever red box.
Is that Moldvay? I'm not a D&D historian. I don't know all the box colors.
I'm terrible.
Red
about
box
it.
is Metzner, gentlemen.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, that's good. We have the mastermind himself here. So thank you, Sean.
Well, I do have my shortcomings. Eric, how'd you get started in duet gaming?
So what's funny is I'm driving around today doing my last minute prep for this, mentally thinking about it, and I've realized I've done way more duet gaming than I recalled. So much like Craig, I started probably gaming 1991, 1992-ish, but it was out of necessity to duet game. We lived in a trailer park out in the country, and there wasn't a lot of people to play with. I had a rule cyclopedia book. I was 13 years old. My brother was 9, so I would run adventures for him. And then my sister, who was more into Barbies, would occasionally play with us, maybe the neighbor kids occasionally. But if we wanted to play D&D, I had to run solo games for my brother. So that was kind of the start. And those were some Monty Hall kind of ridiculous games. You know, when you got a 13-year-old running a game for a 9-year-old, you can only imagine what those were like.
Roll that die. Yeah, just roll high. Roll over a 10. Well, if you roll 10, you do it. You do it if you roll 10.
We tried
playing with Brett.
We actually did domain rules. Yeah, we actually did domain rules where my brother was a monk. I'll just tell you real quick, ridiculous story. My brother was a monk with a blue dragon and a dragon lance, because I was reading the Dragonlance series at the time, and that's how that game went on. But that's how I started, because it was out of necessity. There was no one else to play with, so we had to duet game. And frankly, all of the duet gaming I've done has been because of there's only 2 people want to play. So I'll read real quick about this and try to turn it over to Craig. But so we had my early days, 13-year-old running basic rule cyclopedia. Then in high school, I was a player in a Dark Sun game where we played between junior and senior year of high school all summer, pretty much every day of the week. We'd stay up till like 5 a.m. eating Pizza Hut and drinking Coca-Cola.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
2 people? Just 2 people? You and your buddy?
Yeah, me and my buddy Jim.
Amazing.
My buddy Jim would run the game. We would, in between playing Panzer General on the PlayStation and a bunch of other games, Final Fantasy VII and stuff. So that was that part. And then I'd say the next piece where I did a lot of duet gaming was when I was in the Navy. I had a roommate. We didn't know anyone in the area because we worked a crazy rotating shift work. So we didn't have any friends. It was just him and I. And we played Mutant Chronicles, the original version, not the 2D20 version. And that's what we played. We played a ton of Mutant Chronicles, and he was more the game master on that, and I was a player. So I do have more experience as a player on duet gaming than I do as a game master.
Now, you've been doing it more. You've done it recently, though. That's not where it ended.
That's true. So what I like to use duet gaming now. So I have a buddy who's new to gaming. Just met him a couple years ago. He's a nerd like us, but was more into video games. So what I like to do, one of the methods for duet gaming is like, hey, he's like, I want to try it out. I'm like, okay, cool. Let's do a scenario and let's do that. So I did a solo Solar Blades and Cosmic Spell scenario with him over a few sessions. I've done some duet gaming with Harrigan actually on the Gaming and BS Landia Discord server via Play by Post with Mecha Hack. And then I've also done some duet gaming where it's like, oh, Craig's joining the group, but I don't just want to ram him into the scenario. Right. Like I got to figure out a way to get Craig in the group. So we're going to do a 4-hour whatever session to kind of figure out like how Craig's elf is now traveling with his party across the wastelands, right? Otherwise, it might feel a little forced. Now, sometimes if you have to do it, you got to do it. But if I can, sure, I'd like to do like a solo session to try to, get a person in and kind of get a flow of it. So really lately it's been either teaching a new person how to play or trying to integrate like a new character or a new player into a game.
Yeah, that's a good... I think at least when I think of duet gaming, it's usually, hey, Craig, or hey, Eric, let's play. We'll run a one-on-one game, right? Does that sound good? Cool. We'll just make we'll play it short, see how it goes. Although I think many of us have done it as a precursor to a bigger kickoff, right? Game.
Yeah.
I think that's where it's probably most likely to be seen or, taken place. There's obviously advantages and disadvantages to duet gaming. Some of the advantages, obviously, I think is scheduling. What else, Craig?
There's there's a trust, right? So you have somebody who trusts you, you trust them. There's not a whole lot of wild cards or variables in play. And you, as long as you're doing your check-ins with that person, it could be amazing, because you only have, like, there's only two of you, right? You're not having to, move the spotlight. You're not having to check everybody's temperature, making sure everybody's happy with where things are going. But I will argue that it takes a more awareness and trust than maybe, being able to hide among four players.
Yeah, the person's going to have to engage in the story. Otherwise, it's going to be me talking to myself as the game master, right? Which I'm cool with. I tell my players that all the time. I'm like, guys, if you want these two NPCs to just have like a, solo play here, I can do that. But yeah, Craig's right. I mean, you really get a focus on that person. So if you have a person who might be new, or maybe they're afraid to interact in a large group setting, this is their chance and opportunity to kind of maybe grow some of those skills, and you can show them like, hey, you can, Billy over there, yeah, he's a wannabe actor or voice actor. You can do some stuff like they can. You can engage just as much as they can. So I think that's a huge advantage. I think scheduling, like you said, Sean, is probably the biggest. That's probably the biggest one. I mean, there's only two schedules to manage, and you could work through that.
Yeah, really easy. The thing you mentioned briefly, Eric, was the NPCs. If the player doesn't engage, do you start talking to yourself in like two different people's voices?
That's exactly what you do. It's exactly what you do.
That's exactly what I do too.
All right.
Yeah, and if you go back and watch my actual play of this Mask of Desire, which is the duet, like you'll see that where I'm just talking to myself. And, I think, and Eric, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Like, the role of NPCs is very different in a duet game than it is, I think, in a, 3 or 4 player game. They have a different purpose. And I think you as a GM have to pay a lot more attention in keeping things moving. And keeping things rolling, because again, the other player doesn't have other players to help. And to get that momentum going, your NPCs, I think, play a different role. I mean, have you felt that, Eric?
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. So first thing, I think when you go into a duet game is, what kind of duet game are you going to run? Is this going to be, so in my Mutant Chronicles game where I was a player, it was noir. I was a private detective. I was working mostly solo, except for a few NPCs that I interacted with, like this guy's the doctor that patches me up after I get shot. This guy is the drug dealer on the corner that I slip bribes to. My character had a supermodel girlfriend that never was actually in the game. She was always off in the galaxy doing something. But
in Canada.
Yeah, in Canada.
Niagara Falls.
Niagara Falls, yeah. But in that game, it was really dependent on my character. Now, Craig, you go back to talking about playing mid-'80s duet gaming, and this kind of goes back to Old Gaming and BS episode where we talk about, is D&D a team game? D&D is designed on a party, right? I mean, it is. I mean, so I'm sure someone will email Sean and say Eric's wrong. But my personal opinion is it's designed on a party. So are you going to run the character as their solo and they're doing all the stuff? Or are you going to run a duet game where I'm controlling a party, or I'm controlling 2 or 3 members of a party, or is Craig controlling half the party? Or is there a large party of NPCs and I'm controlling one character in there? That's what you have to kind of decide from a game standpoint, is how much is the player going to take on from a control standpoint, and how much is the game master going to take on? And that is where your NPCs are going to have a larger impact.
Yes, exactly. And I'll die on this hill too, Eric. I think that those scenarios that you put in where, the GM is running the other party members, or the player is running multiple characters, I'll argue that's not duet gaming. And that doesn't mean doing that is bad, but I think that there's something very special about duet gaming. And I think that you're cheating yourself by doing that. And again, if you want to do that, that's fine. But I think you're not truly experiencing how amazing of an experience it can be with just one player, one GM.
Yeah, I agree. And if you're going to, in my opinion, is if you're going to play a game where it's like, hey, Eric, you're going to control a whole party of characters. I have Hero Quest over there. You might as well grab Hero Quest and pull that out and do a dungeon crawl board game, because unless someone out there could be like hyper amazing, but I'm not that guy. I can't role play 5 characters effectively. It gets a little weird because you're going to pick a favorite, and your paladin's going to be the guy that's doing all the talking, or your bard, and then your cleric, whoever's in the background, they just end up being heal bots, or your wizard's just a magic missile machine. So I do agree with Craig.
You're talking about the different rules. Yeah.
Didn't we used to play like that though?
A little bit.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I don't think that that's duet gaming.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. And I think that's, we're talking about advantages. Obviously, disadvantages is when you're dealing with a game system that Eric alludes to that's based on party composition, because you don't have the complementary classes that can do X or Y better than Z. Then you run into a bit of a pickle, right? So Night's Black Agents has solo ops that's created. If you Craig's shaking his or nodding his head. Craig, do you have that? Have you looked it over?
Yeah, I haven't. I've already got it scheduled to run. It's amazing. I will say my only criticism is that they Height kind of made it its own system. He kind of built a couple layers on top of Night's Black Agent, I think, to help like hold up duet gaming. When I'm going to run it, I'm going to pull it back just to the core game pretty much. There's a couple elements in there I'll use, but the scenario that's in that book, and it's got to have like 5 different basically standalone adventures that can all tie together. But it starts off like Jason Bourne, the character wakes up, doesn't know who the F they are, and they have a whole history, and it's out. Well, it's Height. I mean, he knows what he's doing. But it's good. It's good, and it works well, I think, in the solo aspect of Night's Black Agents, where you're a secret agent, right?
Yeah. So when Sean, when you mentioned this, and you were like, "Hey, Eric, do you want to come on the podcast?" And I'm starting to think like, "Oh, well, what would be good things?" I'm like, I was going to say, I find it best in duet gaming when the player's controlling a character, you kind of have to make them Jason Bourne. That was literally the reference that I was going to bring up, because one, in a group of 5 players, 4 or 5 players, you have 4 brains working on a problem, right? So they're going to much more easily be able to come up with a creative solution to said problem to defeat the dungeon master.
That's the mastermind principle.
Yeah.
Right. That's why the show is created, to have people come on and talk about it, right?
The other thing too is, if you're playing a game where mechanically a single person is limited, if I'm playing D&D 2nd edition and we're going to play duet gaming and Craig plays a fighter, I have to throw like 1 kobold at him at a time until he gets to level 5, and then he can fight 2 orcs, and then later on, and because a 2e fighter doesn't have any like or 3.0 or 3.5 or Pathfinder, whatever, they don't have any skills to deal with other problems mechanically in the game. I mean, if you're going to just kind of freewheel and freestyle, sure, okay, you can, if you're going to say Craig's fighter can do things he normally can't do, great. But if my opinion is, it works best when the player character, it has a capable character, because otherwise I've found if you have an incapable character, like a level 1 AD&D 2e wizard, and you're like, oh, I'm going to do this apprentice adventure, which I've tried before, and I'm going to send this wizard out into the wild to go fetch like a leaf from somewhere, he gets killed by a badger in the woods, right? Because he has 2 hit points and can't do anything. Have you experienced that, Craig? Like, what's your feelings on that?
Yeah, I think that you have to be very deliberate about how you design your scenarios and your game. You can't walk in. You can't just grab something off the shelf or something you've done before for parties. And I think this is, especially true in a system like you're talking about, that's a party-based system. But I think it's in any system. I mean, it has to be. It's a different game. It plays different. It feels different. One of the big things that I learned the hard way is you have to be far more liberal about things like clues and hooks. And you also have to be nimble. Believe it or not, you would think you'd have to be more nimble with 4 players. I think you have to be more nimble with 1 player as a GM, because it depends. I'm a follow the table GM, right? So I've got to, like, who the hell knows what one person's going to come up with? And you've got to be ready. You've got to be ready to zig and to zag, and still drop those hooks, still drop those clues.
Right.
So you're not punishing them for taking a right turn.
Well, yeah, in a 4-player game, let's say you're going to react, right? You have 4 things to react to, right? So Sean says something, Brett says something, Harrigan says something, Jim says something. You can pick the best one. In a 1-player game, Craig gives me an idea. I mean, I guess you could be like, you sure? Like, is that like what you really want to do? Like, do you got anything else that I could work with? Because you might have to be like, okay, I'm going to have to go with that and build off of it more. Maybe be more creative from yourself, from Game Master, because you have less clay to work with to, make your sculpture of what you're working on.
When you're playing with 4 players, you could probably, as a Game Master, get 2 or 3 to go, hey, we should probably go that way.
Right.
The one.
This is the 4th time he's mentioned the
one the one goofball that's like, nah, I don't know about that. That would be the solo player.
Right.
Right.
He's the guy that always asks, can I ride it?
Yeah, I want to go up and pet it.
Right.
No, it is. And the other thing too that I found out is you have to really listen to the player and have to pay attention to the player. So you've got to sense they're getting frustrated before they get frustrated.
So Craig, you don't
right?
listen to your players unless there's only one at the table?
I can barely handle having 2 people on this podcast right now. No, I'm saying it is like you've got multiple voices, right, going in there, and you'll have some dominant voices in 3 or 4 players and things like that. And yeah, you definitely are listening to it, but I can have one of my players get frustrated and the table will help manage that, right? They'll kind of boost them up. Let's go, let's try this and so on and so forth. But if I've got one player and they are getting frustrated, I might lose them, right? So I've got to smell it and deal with it far sooner than I may have to do if I've got 3 or 4 players, if that makes any sense. And I'm coming into it from a very specific lens because most recently it was Call of Cthulhu, right? So you've got to be really careful with investigative games like that because we've all played those games before where you feel like you're running into a brick wall left and right, but you can't bounce anything off anybody. So you've got to sense that with your player and you've got to help them. And there were times when we did 5 sessions where I just dropped the most obvious clue on the table. Like I'm, the red lights flashing, all the spotlights hit the note.
Yeah, turn it up.
And it felt so over when I was doing it. Like I felt I was being obnoxious. And then I would talk to Nick after the end of the session and he did not see it that way at all. Like he thought he figured it out and was moving the story forward. So you've got to be ready to sometimes just put it out there.
So Nick, if you're listening to this, you figured it all out. So don't put any credit on Craig's plate there.
We go back to advantages because we're kind of talking more about things to make sure that you are cognizant of. Craig brings up a good point. I've been in some games recently where there's a larger number of players, and it's very easy to kind of be like, okay, I'm kind of off to the side. A big advantage in the solo game or duet game, in this case, not solo, duet, and during investigation is there's one person doing the investigating. So when the party splits, and it inevitably happens in an investigation game, you go to the library, you go to town hall, you go talk to old man on the up on the hill. That doesn't happen. Right. So the player is never going to be, in my opinion, disengaged. Right. You're going to have maximum engagement from that player. If they're bored, it's because they don't want to play the game, period. Right. Like they should be engaged in stuff happening.
One of kind of backing up a little bit to the solo ops and Night's Black Agent and party balance. Like you play I know Craig's it sounds like you're going to change it, but it comes with a pre-generated character.
Yeah, we'll use her.
Oh, you are? Okay. But
yeah.
she's tweaked.
Yes.
Yeah. Not nerfed.
No. No, she's a badass.
Yeah, she's got I think everything. So it'd be like, I don't even know how you would do it in like a game like 5th edition. I don't know if you just have to be like.
You could do it. So we did this in Pathfinder. This wasn't a duet game. This was a 3-person game, but it was Rise of the Rune Lords.
But they wanted to play supers.
Yeah. So what we did is we did the I can't remember what it's called in Pathfinder 1E, but basically your character has 2 character classes. And so you're like a barbarian and a cleric, right? So my barbarian could make himself 30 feet tall and give himself a 5,000 strength. And it was crazy. And I made my own race anyway. It's a whole nother story. But it was total twink.
Of course,
like smurfing out, right? But where's it going on this? Yeah. So the other thing too is okay. So let's say Craig decides to do Knights of Black Agents, but he's like, I don't like this overpowered character because I'm an old school gamer and I want this kind of lower power level, right? And so he goes with that. Well, he better be prepared for that character to get captured, thrown in prison, and not able to escape. Because then what happens, right? Do you just like have them escape? Like you have to think like you might have to change your paradigm if you're used to the characters not being individually as capable. So as a game master, you might have to shift your mental state if you want to run a certain scenario. Like if you want this agent, if you want her to take on some vampire cabal, well, she's going to have to be pretty capable, or you're going to have to rely on a bunch of NPCs. And at that point, like Craig said, are you really running a duet game, or is it kind of more of like you're just stroking your own GM ego to run all your favorite non-player characters?
Yeah, but you can find new challenges in that scenario. So what happens in that solo ops is, the challenge is that this character, even though she's a badass, doesn't know who she is, doesn't know what's been happening, right? So the challenge in the duet, which I'm super anxious to run this, is figuring out that mystery. And that's different, right? So yes, she's a badass, but looking over things, and of course this may change as soon as I brings it to the table. I don't think it's gonna be a combat heavy game. I really don't. I think it's gonna be very investigative, a lot of like holy shits, like there's some really good twists in it. But there's a lot of meat. And the one thing that I learned, and this I was able to carry to running up larger games, is you have to have a little bit of that kind of Cordova method of having like a basket of clues, right? That and a basket of encounters, and those are there, and they can be dropped anywhere. You don't need a specific scenario for it to happen, but you need to have that shit ready, so that when things start screeching to a halt, you can reach into these baskets and you can keep things going and keep the story moving, or not the story. You can keep the adventure moving and the momentum going forward. But I mean, Brindlewood Bay was a huge help as far as structurally understanding that concept, because that's how all the mysteries are set up that way. You don't know who, even the GM doesn't know who did the murder when you're running that. But that concept that Cordova has of having just a basket of tools, of clues, and a basket of encounters, and just having those at your ready, that was huge for me.
And a lot of the stuff we're talking about too applies to like normal gaming too, right? Yeah. I mean, I think it's just amplified more in duet gaming. Turn around a little bit on the host of the show, the king of the masterminds. Have you done much duet gaming, Sean? Like, what's your experiences with that?
When I was thinking about it, I'm like, no, I've never done it. And then I thought about, wait a minute, I just did it yesterday, right? So
your marriage doesn't count.
No, not that kind of role playing, Craig. Jeez,
it's Tuesday, naughty library night.
Yeah, I'm going to edit that out, right? Not with these two yahoos. No, but I'm going to run Impossible Landscapes in August. Craig's going to be part of that game, and one of the so we had some scheduling snafus. Long story short, there's half the party I'm running right now, Delta Green, different scenario. Well, one of the guys is back, and he's like, hey, can't wait to play next week. And I'm like, okay, great. Which I knew, right? He was only going to miss one day during the week or during the month. So he says, okay. I said, I need your characters info, blah, 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 blah. And he's like, okay, I'm going to pick this, like all on Discord in real time. This is what's happening. He's like, okay, I'm going to pick this one. Great. What's their name? This is their name. Air Force, this is what they're going to be doing. Okay, great. And as I was thinking of like bringing him up to speed at the beginning of the next session, he's like, all right, so yeah, I'm sitting at my house, da 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 da, and he just like starts kicking it off, and I go, okay, well you get it, and I kind of said, well, you'll get an envelope. You receive an envelope, and this is what happens. And he's like, okay. I look on it, I pull out the contents, and he just keeps going and going and going, and I'm like, okay, well, lucky for me, I don't have a job right now, so I can do this. So,
that's cool though.
Right, yeah. And so Edwin so I got him to the hotel where he needs to be to meet the rest of the party. So when we get to the next session, they can bring him up to speed. I could probably even I have a recording of the show. I could just send him and he could listen to it. I could say, there, all this.
Let them bring him up to speed.
Yeah.
No.
But so the quick answer is I didn't really consciously make a note of me doing duet gaming, but I know that I've walked through those situations to get somebody into a game, or hey, this is how you meet the party. And it's funny because usually you'll do it at the table when somebody dies and they create a new tune.
Yep.
A new tune. Like people love when I refer to PCs as tunes. But that's so not a ton, not like you guys where you've sat down. I mean, even as a kid, I don't think we would play with just two people.
Sean had more friends than Eric.
Yeah, I guess you lived in the big city, Sean.
No, that's not true. Eric, you knew where I grew up.
I've been across from the apartment that
he
you lived
has.
in.
He has seen the childhood home of Sean Kelly. But it was, rural village town of 1,000 people, and the people that got me into gaming, they, a year or two older than me, and there were three. There was a group of them. It kind of fractured, but I never had. The only time we would do duet gaming as a kid is if we just couldn't, like Billy, Jay, or Joe aren't around, right? So,
honestly, looking back on it, I've probably done more duet gaming than I've actually done group gaming.
Really?
That's the realization I came to today because, sure, I was talking to my buddy Mike Poswald, the guy who actually got me into gaming and BS. I don't know if you remember.
I know Mike. I've
Sean.
met Mike.
Yeah. So I played with him in high school, and he always jokes with me. He's like, I think you remember us playing a lot more D&D than we actually played. Like we did more farting around and building, starting campaigns and building GURPS characters or other things, and then failed. And then I started thinking about it.
So great! I can't wait to play him. He's going to take on the whole galaxy. It's going to be awesome. And then you never play it.
Right. That's my entire career of Car Wars.
Yeah. Oh, well, that was one of the games. I could tell you, I've made many Car Wars cars and have never actually played the game. But
never
for
played.
Sure.
That's a game I need to get into. But I was thinking about it. I was playing that. So the game that we played in high school that was Duet, that was actually Dark Sun. So we played we played a Dark Sun campaign, and I played a half giant gladiator, right? And he was like, the GM gave me a bunch of magic items, because that's another thing. It's like, if you're going to play a 2E type game and you want your players to fight demons and Dracoliches and sand sorceresses in leather bikinis, then you need to give them some sweet magic items to be able to battle them off. So that was. We played a lot of Dark Sun with that, and then and Mutant Chronicles, my characters had a lot of guns. There's a lot of gunfights in that game, so you had to body armor and different things like that. So I think that system matters a lot in duet gaming. So I'll ask this to Craig. Craig, off the top of your head, what are some systems right now? If I was like, hey, Craig, I want to run a duet game, and I want to be a player in it, outside of Knights of Black Agent, because you mentioned that one already. What are some other things that you think would work well for that?
Well, I'm going to start by saying things that I think you'd struggle with is PBTA, because of the playbook concept. I think that really, and which part of what makes PBTA great but that's a party game.
Yeah. And the relationships, that's part of the fun of building that game is I pick a relationship with Craig, and then Craig picks a relationship with Sean. I thought about that too. PBTA from a story game standpoint is cool, but I really think it plays the best with a party.
I agree, and I'll say the same thing for Forged in the Dark, right? Blades in the Dark type game, same type of thing. I will. So when you said Night Blake's Agent, I think Call of Cthulhu works, partially because of kind of what you talked about, Eric, which is, you can have the detective, right? Like that fits into Call of Cthulhu, and you can pretty much run any scenario in Call of Cthulhu and cater it to a single detective.
Craig doesn't have Cthulhu Confidential, do you, Craig?
I do, actually. Trail of Cthulhu.
That is the one-on-one version, by the way.
Yeah, and that was the one I was about to plug, and that is a really interesting book as well. It takes Trail of Cthulhu, and it has 3 kind of mini campaigns, all with 3 different individual pre-made characters, and I've read them, and they're good. They're like really good, and like each of them are thematically different. And I think one of the things I'd recommend to people listening that are thinking about this is pick up one of these scenarios, whether it be the Confidential from Trail of Cthulhu, whether it be the solo ops for Night's Black Agent, or whether it be the Does Love Forgive from Call of Cthulhu. And the reason I say that is I think it's important to see how different the scenarios are, so that you can understand that I can't grab Dark Tower and run it solo, right? Now I can take Dark Tower and change it and adapt it and make it different, but you have to be very conscious of the game you're running and what you can put in front of the characters for multiple reasons. One is character death. 2 is, I think, even more important, is frustration. I think that's one of the huge traps that can occur when you're running solo or duet.
Yeah. So I have a couple systems to recommend too, but I want to hit the character death thing because you mentioned that. So, you have to be, in a D&D game, you're like, oh, if 1 or 2 players die, or characters, we don't want the players to die. That'd be bad. If 1 or 2 characters die during the game, you can replace them, right? You can maybe add some people in, keep story continuity going. In Knights of Black Agent, if Super Agent, dies, game over. So are you going to play a game where when the character hits 0 hit points, they're dead? Or are you going to play a game where when the character hits 0 hit points, they get a wound or some other complication, and now they just have to break out of prison? Like what type of game is this going to be? Is this going to be a hardcore, you're dead, or are you going to play a game that cares more about the narrative continuing on? Vice, it's over, you lost or you won or whatever. Is it more of a, a pass fail type situation? And that kind of goes with, are you going to, if you're, I know, Sean, you've talked about this too with, is it pass fail game, right? Save or suck type thing. So are you going to, okay, I'm going to try to pick this lock. Oh, you fail. You can't pick the lock. Well, I have to get on the other side of the door, and my character's got a 5 strength. They can't get on the other side of the door. I guess I'll sit here and wait for a guard to show up or something.
You can't pick the lock, and you're too weak to slam the door, to push the,
right.
Crush the door. Yeah.
Right.
And I'm going to be a broken record for just a second, but Eric, that's where the scenario is so important. So like you talk about Call of Cthulhu, which is a notoriously deadly system, right? Like everybody jokes, we're going to play for 2 hours and die. But if you look at the scenarios in Does Love Forgive, you realize that that's not what they are. They're not your typical Call of Cthulhu scenarios. And there's very little combat, very little direct encounters with the mythos, but they're still Call of Cthulhu and they're still great. But your player has a very good chance of getting from beginning to end. And that's because it is specifically tailored, even though it's Call of Cthulhu, to duet play. So what are your systems, Eric?
So stuff that I've done recently that works for Duet, Solar Blades and Cosmic Spells, that works because your characters start off fairly capable because it's a D20 roll under system, and you roll 3d6 down the line. And even then, in that type of system, if you roll a 9, you still get a 45% chance of success, which is better than your standard kind of D&D where you're going against like a DC 15, bonus is 25% chance of success. So the characters are fairly capable. The damage in that game is relatively low. Well, you don't gain hit point much over time. And it's got an amazing toolkit too. I'll plug that. Diogo does an awesome job with his D66 tables, and
so good.
Yeah, they're fantastic. Like I can literally run a game like right now for you guys if I had to. It would take me 30 seconds. But anyway, that's a different episode. I ran that scenario, and in that one, like it was like a kid down at the docks in some spaceport gets in trouble with the wrong people, and his aunt hires the character to go find out what happened to him. Right. So that's, go down to the docks, talk to people, go to the bar, talk to people. The guy who was playing it was like more of a rough and tough guy, so he did some roughing up and intimidating. And then you get to the part where he finds out where this guy's been kidnapped, and he's got to go in there and rescue him. And you've got to make sure you give him opportunities like, hey, you don't have to do a frontal assault of this thing. Now, this player in this instance decided to do that. So that's a whole other situation. You're like, are you sure? There's like 5 dudes there. Oh, yeah, I think I can take them. I don't think you can. But okay, let's see what happens. But I think that game works really well for that. I love Mecha Hack. The only Mecha Hack, you start a player off at level 3, and like a Mecha Hack, you're a mech, you're a giant robot, and it's very easy to scale the encounters on that one, where you can have like low level things that are cool. So it's not like you're fighting kobolds the entire time, right? Like you can make really cool fights in battles, and that's more of a combat-y game. But Mecha Hack is great. And then for an old game, Mutant Chronicles works awesome in my opinion. It's a late 90s, early 2000s game, so it's kind of got some of that weird kind of mechanics built into it. But that game's got a very rich character development system. So when your character starts, you like roll for their history like every 2 years. It's kind of like Traveler from that standpoint. So you start at like 26, 28. Your character has a rich backstory. They've had all these careers, like who they are, and you can get right into you're in a diesel punk city on the moon, and you can get right into kind of like a Blade Runner-esque like investigative type game, like right off the bat. So those are 3 systems that I think work really well for duet gaming.
And you prompted my memory a little bit, because there's 2 other systems that I have not done. So I'm not saying they would work, but it pops into my head. And one is Star Trek Adventures from Modiphius. And the reason I wonder if that would be interesting is because there's built-in mechanics for you to transfer to other crew members. So they don't become other characters. You quickly roll up the character that's the assistant science officer, because they're the one that's going to go on they're the red shirt that's going to go to the planet, and you're playing the captain, so you have to stay on the ship. So I'd be interested to see if that would fit. But I've never run it. I've only read it. The other one I think would be interesting is they came from below the grave. They came from beyond the grave. And that has an interesting system where it's set in the 70s. So it's supposed to be like, Alice Cooper, Vincent Price, like 70s horror, right?
Nice.
And then you play characters in that kind of that era of movies. But everything that they deal with in the movie was trouble that was created back in the 1800s, right? So somebody killed a woman and a witch back in the 1800s, and that's why the house is haunted. And so you're playing that characters in the 70s dealing with the haunted house, and the GM will flash you back to the 1800s and put you in other characters to live through the backstory of how the house got haunted. So I wonder if that would work too. I might have to dive back into that system and look at it again. It's Storyteller White Wolf.
Okay, yeah, and something I just noticed a trend. So I brought up 3 science fiction kind of modernish games. That's kind of where my sweet spot is right now. I'm kind of drifted away from fantasy. You brought up Cthulhu, which is 20s to now horror. Fantasy, I think, duet gaming in my head is probably the hardest to do.
Challenge.
So what systems could work well to do fantasy duet gaming where you're not doing that's my favorite example, where you have to fight kobolds in the forest until you're level 20 and you could actually go do something. I mean, in my head, Sharp Swords and Sinister Spells, plug Diogo again. He eventually will release 2nd edition at some point. I think that would work.
Primal.
Which
from Diego?
Which one?
Primal?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Primal.
Oh, Primal Quest. Yeah, I haven't got a chance to look at the Primal yet.
That would work.
That would work. Okay. So I'm trying to think of other fantasy games because that's the most popular genre. 5e, I think you could do 5e because, you'd have to, CRs would be tough, right?
You'd have to really do basic. Just do basic and expert, OSE. Yeah. And here's the reason why I think some of those games would be okay is anything that doesn't rely on a ton of skills and that it's player skill, right? So you might get into weird situations where you don't have the cleric to heal or you don't have the rogue to pick a lock, but those are things you either don't put in front of the player character,
right,
or you give them more than one option if they come across the lock or they get hurt. Because mechanically, if you've seen a character sheet from basic, there's nothing to that thing.
Yeah.
And it's usually based on whatever, story that they want to bring in and say, well, I should probably know that. Or because you're a gong farmer. Well, that's why it's trampling through your fields,
Right. Well, and you could do to maintain the kind of the smallness, it could be like, hey, you're playing kind of more of a jack of all trades character, and I know I need someone to pick a lock, right? You find out that the Duke has this magic item in a chest in his bedroom, and you can't pick locks because you're a fighter, right, or whatever, and you're like, all right, well, I got to go get a guy, and that's the whole adventure, is finding the right locksmith or lockpicker in town. And then you get him and you hire him and they go with you, and it's one NPC instead of like a whole party of people going with you, right? Or you're going to go into this forest that's dangerous and there's a bunch of poison in there, so you go hire a cleric to come with you to help. You're like you're going to get poisoned at some point. You got to fight a giant scorpion or something, and they're the person that's going to get the poison away from you or whatever.
I think urban adventures usually will work a little bit better because you could still have urban fantasy where you've got somebody going through the town, Streets of Avalon, plug Brett Blazinski, go buy it, where you're the solo person in the town, so you have all the resources. You just have to go and get them, like you said, Eric. So once they go outside the town and they run into 6 kobolds, well, then they might be in trouble. But hopefully they're wise enough to not go alone, or maybe they have help or a faithful companion that can, like a dire wolf companion. So
I was just gonna say the Ranger's the perfect duet game. Ranger
wielding
with a wolf
dual
companion.
scimitars, silver hair, dark skin. Why not, buddy? Green cloak, yeah.
Yeah.
So here's the challenge I'll put forward to everybody, and that includes people listening. Is what we're talking about is trying to adapt solo play to traditional play, right? So how do we allow traditional play to happen, but it's a solo game? And my challenge is don't do that. Change the scenario, right? So we've been talking about what systems would work. Now that I'm hearing us talk about it, and I was one of them running my mouth, I think it's more interesting to talk about what are the types of scenarios to run.
Right.
Because I think that changes. And I think that's what changes in duet games, right? Doing a dungeon crawl with locked doors and secret doors and traps and stuff could be not good for solo.
Yeah. And
I don't care whether you're running old school OSR from somebody as smart as Diego or you're running, basic. It doesn't matter. But if you're going to run D&D, then take this opportunity to run a different type of scenario that isn't, go rescue the town from the invading goblins, make it a murder mystery, make it something else. So that's the challenge I'll put forth, is before you start trying to adapt solo play to traditional scenarios, think about what you can do to the scenario to adapt it to solo play.
I think a Game of Thrones game, right? Everybody likes Game of Thrones. Like, it was hugely successful.
I don't like Game of Thrones. Just point that out for the record.
This is the last podcast Eric will ever be on. And so, and it just invalidates all of the things he's previously said in the last 40 minutes. But anyways, say, for example, you live on Earth and you are appreciative of the Game of Thrones franchise. The thing is, with that game, if you were to run that with a typical group, it would be relatively difficult. It is so much a solo or maybe even a 2-player, one game master game, right? Because how do you do all the intrigue and everything when you're in a group that's when the game is set up in a different way?
You bring up
what I love about that.
I was going to say, you bring up a great point. I'll be quick, because you look at Game of Thrones, epic fantasy, large character grouping. You think like, oh, that could be D&D, but then you go look at Dragonlance, which was the first book was based on the module. yes, lots of characters, but that's a party, right? And in Game of Thrones, I guess it's more like old school D&T. Lots of the party dies, and they replace lots of characters. Spoiler: lots of people die in Game of Thrones. But yeah, you make a good point to Craig. Yeah.
Well, and to build off of that, Sean, is you couldn't play every character in Game of Thrones solo. Right. But again, and I'm gonna beat this dead horse on the scenario thing. You take a step back and go, well, who could you do? So you could do solo play with Cersei.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Right. You could do solo play with
Arya.
Tywin. Right. Arya could do solo. Right. So there's some characters in there because of they're where they are in the world and how they encounter and deal with the world. That would be scenarios that solo play would do. Whereas like a Jon Snow or even the Lannister brother, he wouldn't work well because he's just running into things, right? It's not quite the same type of scenario. So it's an interesting thing with Game of Thrones.
And the books are all done by the chapters of the individuals, I believe.
Yeah, which is cool.
Yeah, right. So one of the things I'm curious about, and I haven't, do you guys still run a full session with a one-person player? Like 3 or 4 hours? Because I think I look at it this way. 8 hours. So I look at it this way. If I had 4 players and I were to run a session, typically I would run a session for like 4 hours to make it worth everybody's while, make sure the spotlight's spread around. You could cover some ground. Why don't you run one player for like an hour and a half?
Well, you could. We could.
You could, but you cover so much in 3 hours, though. That's that's another advantage of solo play is you get much farther along in solo play, in my experience, than you do in group play.
Yeah, there's less bickering about, do we go left? Do we go right? Should we go talk to the butcher or the baker or the candlestick maker? Plug for Brett Blinzinski and Third Floor Wars to go watch this Avalon stream that was excellently done, by the way. There's less arguing over, like, what are we going to do? It's like, I'm like, Craig, what are you going to do? And he has to make a decision. And as long as Craig isn't paralyzed by the decision, he's eventually going to make one. And it's going to be in a lot less time than 4 people making a decision. I can tell you that.
Yeah. I was just saying that maybe you could, obviously you could play either way, but I just thought if you were just to want to get scheduling down, which is quick, and then you don't want the obligation to be, a huge commitment, 2 hours, so not solo, duet gaming, you could still cover a ton. You could probably cover a ton in an hour.
That's a big advantage of it. I agree. You could get a lot more done. I mean, if you like back in the day, like I said, we played like every night. My buddy Jim and I would hang out, and if we'd played like 6, 7, 8 hours. I mean,
that's crazy.
We'd conquer all of Dark Sun in that amount of time, right?
I finished the game.
There's breaks in there, right? And lots of pizza and Mountain Dew need to be consumed in between things. But I agree with you, Sean. That would be an advantage. You could literally play like a 2-hour session and actually get quite a bit done.
Yeah.
Vice if the 4 people were playing on a 2-hour session.
It's
pretty mentally taxing, I've heard.
It definitely is. It's exhausting for both the GM and the player. It takes a lot. It takes a lot out of you, and I think I have found it takes a little bit more prep because of the baskets I was talking about. But I can't wait to do it again. And anybody who's listening who has not done it, do it. I went into it somewhat kind of like, I'll try it, no big deal. And I came out of the faith. I'm a huge fan of it. I can't wait to do it again. And I am a better GM after doing it than I was before.
I was going to say, what have you learned from doing duet gaming that you probably hadn't either experienced or realized after the fact? Even became better. How? Right? That's a question. I didn't frame that up very well, did I?
This is embarrassing. I think the biggest thing that I took out of it, and this is not, I don't think, general universal. I learned that I can be a lot more overt with hooks and clues. I thought I had to be a lot more clever than I was, and I realized that I was only the only person identifying how clever I was me, right? That like you have to kind of like be a little bit more overt. Don't be afraid to put the key in the basket and let them get the key, right? And it's funny because it was that experience that made me realize that I was being a little too clever for my own good. And then the other thing that made me realize it was being a player and having it done to me, both overtly and not overtly. Because when it was done overtly to me, I didn't think about it until like hours later. I was like, oh, he just handed that to us. But it didn't feel that way in gameplay. So I think that was a big takeaway is it's very easy for us GMs to get way too clever for our own good.
Yeah, and what I learned is I like to combat just as much as anyone. It's the reason why I play role-playing games. I mean, I do want some orc killing to happen at some point in my fantasy game. But what I learned is I got better at building non-combat scenarios because, I mean, combat can be a grind, right? Depending on the game you're playing, it can just be too much, right? So it helped me get way better at coming up with like problems and things to solve that could not be solved by combat, right? Because a party of 4 can usually bash something down, unless you give them a giant monster that's clearly too strong for them, right? With a duet game, it's much easier. It's so easy to overwhelm the player with a combat encounter. You have to come up with things that are more interesting to deal with, and then when you do happen to have a combat encounter, you have to make it more interesting because they can't just outmuscle 5 thugs with shotguns, right? Like you got to come up with, okay, there's cover here. These guys are elevated. There's barrels of oil over here that they could shoot, there's a forklift that you could hop in and drive into that, like you have to create more things. And then when they ask like, oh, hey, is there a forklift I can jump in this warehouse? You're like, well, it's a warehouse. Yeah, there of course is a forklift. And then you just determine how far away it is, right? So I think it's helped me become more creative with the scenarios that they're going to be allowed to. And from a player standpoint, I feel like it's made me a better role player, like going forward, because I used to be pretty introverted when I was younger. And then now I'm super extroverted. I know. So like Sean's like, what?
Get out of here.
Yeah. No, I was. I had a shell and I didn't really come out of it until, my early 20s. So I think that duet gaming helps do that because you're talking and you gain confidence in being a character and just kind of expressing yourself. And I think that's a big advantage too.
I think I'm going to run. So if I get one game night a week, right? And it's 3 hours, I'm going to run 3 duet games in one night every other week. Then I'm playing 6 games or 4 games. My math is off.
Well, let's take all the advantages of duet gaming. Let's throw it out. Let's make it a scheduling nightmare. Great idea, Sean.
Way to ruin a good thing, Sean.
I'm always thinking.
You are. You're a thinker.
Well, hey, I think that wraps it up. I think we covered everything about duet gaming. We talked about some of the disadvantages of that as we conversed and everything. I hope everybody got something out of this conversation. Thank you so much, Craig and Eric, for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
I'm loving the show, Sean. So I was really looking forward to coming on. I really have been enjoying the other episodes.
Great. Thank you.
I will not lie that I was in a state of shock and sadness when Gaming and BS announced its ending, and I was happy to hear that at least one half, the B, was gone and the S was removed. No, I'm just kidding. I'm happy that some level of the show is still going on with you, Sean. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. We'll have links to where you can find Craig and Eric down in the show notes if you want to check that out. By all means, visit them where they are online and consume what they are producing. You can find both of them frequent our Discord if you want to go to gmmastermind.com/Discord. They're on there every once in a while. And I think I'm going to try duet gaming. I think I'm going to get one off the ground.
I think you definitely should, man. As should everybody who's listening.
All right. On behalf of my fellow guests, thank you for tuning in, and remember, be a positive force in the tabletop RPG hobby. GM Mastermind, produced with help from the following members of the Mind: Joe Swick, Zagrave, Mirko Froelich, Tony Sugarloaf Baker, Polish Ogre, Larry Hollis, Huskarl, Harrigan, Farty McButterpants, Laramie Wall, Aaron Relia, Wayne Peacock, Ron Bishop, Ghost GM, Old School DM, Craig Shipman, Larry Hout, John Mahoney, Yorkus Rex, Eric Salzwedel, Phil McClory, Jason Hobbs, Michael O'Holland, Remy Bilodeau, Crystal Eggstad, Eric Avia, Feelin' Good Lewis, Eric Jeppesen, Vornak, Brian Kurtz, Chad Glayman, Jim Ingram, Orcus Dorcas, and Chris Shorb. Thank you to each and every one of you. I really appreciate it. I hope you're all subscribed. In your podcatcher of choice, bring up GM Mastermind, hit subscribe. Another thing I would greatly appreciate.